Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Youssef, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you like to introduce me to David Morales? Or it's David Sanchez Morales. It's the one area of the JFK case I really haven't looked into specific names, just because it brings up a lot of controversy when people start pointing like who might have done it. I try to just understand the bigger picture, but you've done extensive work. I said I was going to have you back on to talk about David Sanchez Morales, and I'm hoping you can give me a breakdown of who he was, how you got interested in looking into him, and what you're able to find.
Yeah, well, thanks, Robbie, for having me back. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, I mean, David Sanchez Morales, I've come across through my, research for a book on this kind of clique of hardline CIA operatives from this period, really during the height of the Cold War. So I've been particularly focusing on David Atlee Philips, but David Sanchez Morales was definitely one of this hardcore clique who were involved in a series of absolutely kind of key operations running through from the kind of post-war era, from the 50s through to the 70s. And he kind of was in the U.S. Army after the war. I think he was stationed in Germany, I believe. He was then eventually recruited into Army intelligence, it seems, during the late 40s, and eventually into the CIA and into specifically the Directorate of Plans, which was the clandestine, the covert operations arm. Deal in many ways about Morales compared to some of the other figures from the JFK story. For example, he's something of a he has a kind of patina of mystique about him. There are certainly some documents when you kind of search through the archives pertaining to him, but I don't think there is anything like the same volume of material that you have on people like David Atlee Phillips or say Howard Hunt or William Harvey.
Now, is your book on Morales or is your book on Phillips?
No, my book's on David Atlee Phillips when it hopefully gets published in the near future.
His
But
son's still alive, isn't he?
who's that? Who
Dave,
Phillips or
yeah, David Atlee
yeah?
Phillips.
Well, at least one of David Phillips's sons is alive. Is specifically Phillips Jr., who I've had some correspondence with and has been quite kind of forthcoming and quite helpful. Certainly, I haven't had a proper kind of sit down with him. He's works in a completely unrelated area. He's an anthropologist, I believe. So
How about the?
a bit.
Oh wait, no, that's Agi, whatever his name is. His son runs a magazine. I forgot what his name. Ag, I think his name is what? Yeah, Philip Ag. His son runs a magazine or something like that. Covert Action magazine that talks a lot about what his dad and other things have done too. It's like kind of with Saint John Hunt and his dad with Howard Hunt. They somehow openly speak out about this, which I find is interesting that they didn't really like what exactly that their parents were doing and what they were told.
Yeah, I guess in some kind of weird Freudian, like psycho, perhaps psychoanalytical way, they're probably trying to come to terms with the sins of the fathers. Um, yeah, I think that is interesting. I mean, I don't think I think with David Phillips' son, the kind of relatively limited correspondence I've had, he doesn't seem to be inclined that way. I think he is quite tired of all the kind of conspiratorial kind of chat, and I don't think he believes his father was involved in it. But it doesn't sound like he's perhaps spent a great deal, expended a huge amount of energy looking into it. Really, I think. I mean, certainly what he did say to me was that his father was very hurt, apparently, to be at the kind of insinuations that he was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. So I guess you have to kind of take that kind of statement at face value. But the question is really what's I suppose is what's it worth really, because you're not really going to open up to your children, are you, and tell them if you have been involved in these kind of things. I think you're going to probably keep that hidden from them most likely.
What piques your curiosity about either Phillips or Morales that you think that they might have had some involvement into Is it just because their background and some government operational stuff? I mean, that's a good reason for skepticism for sure. But how does it relate to like the Kennedy assassination or their involvement?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think a lot of this probably this came out of the 1970s government investigations, where a number of um, obviously scandals, CIA scandals particularly, were exposed pertaining to regime change, to other operations. For example, something you're very interested in, of course, which is the MK Ultra mind control programs. FBI operations as well, such as COINTELPRO, were exposed, um, and other CIA operations, so particularly assassinations, and that led to the House investigation into the reopening the investigations into the assassinations of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And that House investigation in the late 70s concluded that the assassination of JFK was a probable conspiracy, although they didn't specify as to the identity of such conspirators. And that's where a lot of these kind of infamous characters, such as Phillips, Hunt, Bill Harvey, in fact, the entire pretty much surviving CIA kind of leadership, the likes of Richard Helms and others, were all kind of summoned for to give testimony on various subjects, including the Kennedy assassination. And Phillips became quite a notorious character because of his association with Lee Harvey Oswald. The fact that Phillips had been working in Mexico City in 1960, in the early 60s, and by his own admission, had been aware of Lee Harvey Oswald prior to the assassination, and had been specifically aware of Oswald's visit to Mexico City, which is shrouded in mystery and is certainly considered to be the kind of Rosetta Stone of the case. What exactly was Oswald doing in Mexico City? Was he even there? Was he impersonated? All these kind of very strange, unanswered questions about that episode. So I think that's where Phillips has never, particularly has never really shaken off this rather sinister reputation. It stems, I think, a lot from that association, and also from the kind of, I guess, allegations or assertions that are somewhat perhaps half-hearted, but the allegations that were made by a Cuban exile leader called Antonio Vecchiano, who only died a few years ago, actually, who suggested that his CIA handler, Maurice Bishop, may have been David Atlee Philips, or at least said, sorry, that at the time, his story obviously kept changing, but at the time he originally said in the late 70s that his CIA handler, Maurice Bishop, that was the pseudonym, had witnessed him with Lee Harvey Oswald a few weeks before the JFK assassination. And as the investigations unfolded, David Atlee Phillips became a figure of, suspicion, probably the most prominent figure thought to be Maurice Bishop. And this remained unconfirmed for decades, but in the last kind of 10 years, well, last few years, even of his life, Antonio Vecchiano came out and said that Maurice Bishop was David Atlee Phillips. But since then, there's been a further twist, and certain researchers, such as I think it's John Newman, isn't it, have cast a lot of doubt about Vecchiano's stories and credibility, and have suggested that maybe the whole Maurice Bishop story was just basically a big distraction, that Phillips and the likes of Howard Hunt may have just been what's called limited hangouts, just a kind of more sophisticated patsy that had been thrown to satisfy the public when the kind of old version of the story is worn thin.
Well, sowing disinformation for political reasons isn't I don't think that's not believable. You know what I mean? There's a lot of things about this case that doesn't make sense. The Bashuka lady, the umbrella man. There's a bunch of stuff that just is weird incidences happening in Dallas that day. And, to think that there was more than one shooter is not crazy. To say that there wasn't a bunch of stuff going on, like all the different ramblers that were going on. But the Mexico City and Phillips, do you think that it could be possible he was lying and that's why there's such confusion with the Mexico City thing? Because I probably fall in the camp that he never went to Mexico City, even though a lot of people still kind of think he does.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated to unpack. I think Phillips, in his testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the House investigation, I think we'll call it for short, in the late 70s. He got caught in about 4 different lies and inconsistencies, really. So he specifically had told the government House investigation that, for example, the tapes, the audio tapes, because the CIA was running a massive wiretapping operation from Mexico City, so from their Mexico City station. Mexico City, just to kind of introduce a bit of background, was the Berlin of the Americas. It was an absolute hive of espionage because of its proximity to the United States, its proximity to Cuba. So all the major countries, such as the Russians, the Cubans, the Americans, as well as all the major American intelligence agencies, were based in, or had rather, major stations in Mexico City.
And a lot of and one interesting point to that about Mexico City is that there were films back in the day, like I think the 40s or 50s, that were all propaganda against Mexico, trying to steer people away from Mexico, like saying that all these and the reason I say that it's interesting is because they did the same thing in Latin America, and we found out that the FBI and CIA and all these people were over in Latin America and Ecuador and all these other places where there's films about saying like horrible this and all this, like communist scare tactic type deals. They did the same thing with Mexico City, and then you find out Mexico City is like this foreground for spies. It's like this. It's just interesting to me where I start looking at all these films now. I'm like, okay, what else were they kind of trying to keep us away from their dirty stuff?
Well, I mean, on that note, there's certainly, in terms of the kind of archival research that I've done, there are documents specifically on kind of Phillips's like internal kind of report cards, if you like, a bit like school report cards, where they have their kind of internal assessments every year or so. And there's one on Phillips's kind of sterling work in Mexico City, where they comment that he'd almost kind of single-handedly, through his connections with kind of assets with particularly Mexican journalists and so on, had almost single-handedly kind of changed the complexion of political life in Mexico through his kind of intensive propaganda and psychological operations work. So yeah, Phillips was particularly instrumental at the heart of what was, in the words of, I think it was John Whitten, who was I think also based in Mexico City, was another CIA officer. His code name was Celso. I think he was tasked by Helms in the immediate aftermath of the JFK assassination with the CIA's own internal investigation of the assassination, and was then later taken off, having been kind of undermined by Angleton. And Angleton, I think, was appointed mainly to that kind of liaison role with the Warren Commission. But Celso, or John Whitten, as he came to be known, has said that the Mexico program that the CIA was running was absolutely massive, and particularly its kind of surveillance of the Russian and Cuban compounds, where Oswald appears to have been present in late September, early October of 1963. And so there were actual, human monitors, as they're known, so kind of people working for the agency, informants in the embassies, the Cuban and Russian embassies. There was obviously phone tapping. There were cameras monitoring the entrances, and they were sifting through the rubbish. So this was kind of one of the CIA's crown jewels, was this kind of massive daily digest of intelligence. So Oswald kind of was purportedly picked up in his encounters in both the Russian and Cuban embassies, particularly on the phone lines. And one of Phillips's 4 kind of inconsistencies in his testimony was that he claimed that those tapes had been routinely kind of erased, they'd been routinely recycled. And it later became apparent to government investigators during the 70s, the late 70s, that this wasn't the case, that in fact FBI personnel tasked by Hoover straight after the assassination on 22nd of November had arrived in Mexico City and listened to those tapes, and were astonishingly of the opinion that that was not Oswald's voice on the tapes. And even more remarkably is that in April of 64, 2 of the Warren Commission's investigators, one of whom was a lawyer who's still alive, David Slawson, also traveled to Mexico City and listened to those tapes. So whether, of course, Phillips was referencing the original tapes, or perhaps I guess he can get out of it by saying he was not referring to copies of the tapes, but rather to the originals. But even so, I think he was obviously not being kind of honest about that particular aspect. But there were other kind of inconsistencies that also became apparent. So he didn't come out of that testimony unscathed. It looked like he was hiding something.
Was there any, I guess, punishment for him lying in court like that or lying in this investigation?
I think he was, yeah, certainly when you read the kind of transcripts, he was reprimanded, in quite kind of schoolmasterly way. He was kind of told by the kind of I think it's a lawyer who was carrying out the kind of inquisition, if you like, that this was a very serious matter. That they were trying to investigate the assassination of the president and whether there was a conspiracy, whether the CIA was involved, and that he was basically very sternly reprimanded. But of course, this testimony is done under oath, and in the case of Richard Helms, he was forced as a result of lying under oath. He was given he was actually had to kind of, there was a court case. He was put on trial as a former director of the CIA for lying to Congress under oath, and he was I think found guilty of that in the case of Richard Helms, and he was given a suspended sentence. So it is very serious, kind of even legally. But I think in the case of Phillips, there probably wasn't enough evidence to kind of prove that I suppose that he'd done anything that was
Do you think he was part of the
sufficient.
Do you think he was part of the setup for Oswald, like the little patsy thing? I mean, a number of people were using his name.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's what's interesting is that obviously we've got the Phillips's own kind of admissions in his memoirs that he knew of Oswald's existence, and from that same government testimony that he was aware of Oswald prior to the assassination. But Phillips's cover story was, well, Oswald was just another blip on our radar. It was just a walk-in, some random American who turns up, of which there were supposedly several who turn up, offering their services for whatever reason to the kind of Russians and the Cubans. And that was basically his story. But that story became kind of harder and harder to kind of legitimize and to keep that story going as you kind of dig deeper and deeper into things, and as Phillips's own lies and inconsistencies became apparent. So he was. I think he was really grilled compared to, say, the performance of others such as Angleton, who comes out, I would say much better off compared to Phillips. Phillips, was appeared to be hiding quite a lot. I think when you add to that the Vesiana allegations, and then when one of the things that Phillips had a second memoir, a little known memoir, in which he did write something about, in a bit more detail than his more well-known memoir, The Night Watch, where in this kind of second memoir, which is the kind of Secret Wars diary, he did kind of allude to the fact that his relationship to Oswald was more than just kind of arbitrary or random, and that he may have been monitoring. He may have been, I think, in his own words, in that second memoir, he may have been watching the reaction of the Russians or rather specifically the Cubans, particularly the reaction of the Cubans to Oswald's kind of provocative tactics. So it suggests, I think, there, even by his own admission, that original story about, just no way that the CIA could have known, anything about this random American who walked in Mexico City to the kind of Russian and Cuban compounds and then went on to kill JFK a few weeks later. That cover story does start to wear thin, particularly when you focus in on the whole story about the kind of the photographs, the fact that the CIA, despite again this intensive surveillance, despite the fact that it had cameras covering the entrances of these compounds, that it couldn't produce a photo of Oswald, and when it did produce a photo, it was a photo of a completely different man. So when you scrutinize Phillips's story on the photos, his version was that the camera had broken down or wasn't working on the weekends, for example. But Gaetan Fonzi, who was one of the House investigators at the time, he managed to speak to some of the kind of agency's personnel and insiders working at the Mexico City station, and it became clear to Fonzi that this story was pabulum, that the agency actually had multiple cameras. I think there was some truth to the fact that a new camera had been installed and was being tested and was removed to see the results and so on. I think there was probably some truth to that, but it does appear from certainly Gaetan Fonzi's story that there were multiple cameras, and there does appear to be kind of evidence from others. That there are others, such as I think Win Scott, who was the Mexico City station chief, and others who seem to have hinted at the fact, that a photo of Oswald was seen in in Mexico City, but had been basically destroyed or disappeared. So yeah, I think there's certainly to try and get to the bottom of why the CIA, it does sound like to me like Oswald was there, but why the agency wasn't prepared to produce an actual photo of him. I think there's lots of reasons for that. I think they were, and that's something you can go into separately. It's a whole other story. I think they had their own reasons, perhaps, for not wanting to produce that photo publicly. So there's that kind of whole story that again Phillips got very much caught up in his own inconsistencies, or if you want to be a bit harder hitting in I guess versions that beggared belief or didn't sound very honest or truthful.
Well, he was just he's not in charge of making his own duties and everything, so that he's got to be taking orders from somebody, right? So are they assuming that it's James Angleton that he's getting his orders from?
Well, no, Phillips would have been specifically under Win Scott, who was the chief of station, and I think Scott was quite a tough boss to work for. He worked extremely hard. He kind of was someone with a real work ethic. He was somewhat perhaps on the spectrum, if you like, and he had this kind of ramshackle filing system that only Scott really kind of knew how to navigate and how to access using his kind of photographic memory. So Win Scott was quite eccentric in his own ways, but very demanding and taxing as a boss, and Phillips kind of testified about that. So I think Win Scott certainly, based on his biographer Jefferson Morley, was quite peeved off about this kind of cover story that the Mexico City station effectively missed Oswald. That was the kind of cover story that was used, but Win Scott really kind of prided himself, according to his biographer, on his performance, and the Mexico City station was, as we said, one of the crown jewels. So this idea that they kind of didn't investigate Oswald properly really did not sit very well with Win Scott. But I think Win Scott himself doesn't seem to have been involved in anything particularly fishy. I think he was kept out of the loop, and I think he got quite miffed about that. The fact that people like Angleton, and Angleton and his team, people like Angleton's deputy Ray Rocker and others, clearly knew a lot more about Oswald based on the kind of documents and memos we now have. For example, the HT Lingual program, which was the mail interception program for Oswald, they were kind of intercepting Oswald's letters, and they knew about Oswald going back to his defection to the Soviet Union in '59. So that's where again the Mexico City episode starts to get even more ramifications to it. Is that the memos that have now since been declassified on the Mexico City episode are very confusing, because they refer refer, for example, to a Lee Henry Oswald. That's what the Mexico City station call him. And then
I've seen documents that that was a spelling mistake by the person that was working the filing system, but I see that to come up in multiple documents to say it's more than a filing mistake.
yeah, well, that's what so in the marginalia, that's what Wynne Scott had written, I believe SIC, implying that it was incorrect. And that correction was actually identified when that memo was sent from the Mexico City station to HQ, to CIA HQ at Langley. And they sent back a memo saying, well, we this is, you're probably referring to Lee Harvey Oswald, who, blah, 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 came back from, the Soviet Union and, defected as a Marine, as an ex-Marine, came back in 62. And that was it. And they left it at that. So the HQ, did correct some of the information, but told the Mexico City station that the last kind of operational information they had on Oswald was from May of 62, and omitted to mention the fact that they knew a lot more than that. The fact that Oswald in the summer of 63 had been in New Orleans, that he'd got into a fight with some of the CIA's favorite anti-Castro Cubans, specifically the DRE, that's the Student Directorate, which was being run, was actually founded by Phillips, was being run at the time by George Joannides,
And so it was
and
founded
quite
by
successful.
Phillips.
Yeah, I believe Phillips was the person who'd created that particular Cuban exile group, the DRE, which included a guy called Carlos Bringuez, still alive again, I believe, in his late 80s, roughly, if not 90 by now.
Look, they're never going to talk.
Wrote
They're never going to talk.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, Bringuez just, his story, Oswald directly came into contact in that time with Carlos Bringuer and offered his services, saying, I'm an ex-Marine, I can, help with training you guys. And then a few days later, Oswald's seen on the street corner handing out these flyers, which are, for the FPCC, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, with, of course, that infamous address 554 Camp Street, which was the base for, of course, for Guy Bannister, ex Private Eye and ex, Chicago office head of the Chicago FBI office. So, and a kind of central base for anti-Castro operations. So that was a very obviously strange story. And then Carlos Bringuer and his, a couple of his, I think, colleagues, whatever you want to call them, a couple of the other kind of anti-Castroids got into a fight with Oswald. Oswald gets arrested. The arresting officer, arresting cop, says, he kind of suspected it was all a bit staged. Anyway, he's arrested. Oswald, bizarrely, as a supposed leftist, asks for the FBI, probably the first and last leftist in the history of the world to do that. Gets an interview with Hosty, I think it is James Hosty, and is let off with a fine, but gains enough kind of notoriety and profile that he's interviewed. He's invited onto the radio to be interviewed, and in fact, the people running that radio program, I think it was Ed, I want to say Stuckey or Butler, but I can't remember the name now. He's actually an informant for either the FBI or the CIA. But anyway, Oswald, sorry, this keeps tripping up. Let's just try and steady that. And then Oswald is interviewed with Bringuer. Carlos Bringuer is also on that show. And interestingly, when you read that or listen to it, Oswald is actually very intelligent, articulate, and eloquent. The complete opposite of this kind of Warren Commission caricature of some lone nut, unstable, unhinged, unpredictable sociopath. He comes across as very reasoned and eloquent. So yeah, that all happened, and then immediately one of the things that's very weird is that straight after the assassination, in the immediate aftermath, and I think again there are documents showing some kind of interaction or communication between George Joannides and these kind of groups such as the DRE. They start immediately after the JFK assassination spreading rumors that Castro was behind it. Now, you can obviously argue that they were always going to do that. But Carlos Bringuer continued to peddle this story for years, if not decades, and he wrote a book called, I think, Red Friday, all about how Castro did it. So this seems like it was. You've got to remember that the CIA was funding the DRE to the tune of, I think, $51,000 a month. So as you can imagine, that's I believe it was per month. That's a hell of a lot of money back then. So it does look like the DRE's performance after the assassination was pre-prepared, that this was a kind of psyops, kind of a propaganda operation to try and peddle and push this story straight after the assassination that Castro was behind it. And later, of course, Joanides is even more of a notorious figure, because he's unknowingly, to the House investigation, brought in to act as the liaison between the CIA, brought out of retirement, in fact, to act as the liaison between the CIA and the House investigation, in contravention of the rules that had been laid down, that no active, operational officers from 1963 should be involved in that kind of liaison work, or any other kind of work with the House investigation, unless, of course, they're being brought to give testimony or to provide evidence. And that was only revealed, obviously, much later. I think in the 90s, at the time, it was revealed. Professor Blakey, who was in charge of the House investigation, realized that the CIA had been kind of playing him and playing the entire investigation, undermining it, sabotaging it, as they'd done with the Warren Commission, withholding information and doing things that were, much more obviously nefarious and insidious. They had, it was, the fox in the kind of hen hoop. I mean, to have the guy who was running the DRE in the summer in 1963, at the time that JFK was assassinated, to then bring him in to help the House investigation with identifying documents and so on is just beyond belief. And of course, Joanides knew where all the bodies were buried, of course, so he was the perfect person to do that, to perform that duty, and was later given the kind of CIA's highest accolade, I believe.
Where was Phillips when the assassination took? Where was the Phillips when the assassination took place?
Well, yeah. Sorry, stop doing that. So I'm afraid this book is all a
You're
bit
good. There's a bit of a
strange.
delay too, so I'm not trying to interrupt you.
Yeah. Sorry, no worries. Yeah, I mean, Phillips, according to his memoir, was in Mexico City, I believe. But there is, circumstantial evidence that he may have been in Dallas. So there is, according to Bill Simpich, there's a whole series of memos. There's at least one that I've seen in which he's working on the exfiltration of a Cuban asset, I think quite an important Cuban asset for the agency, in the days building up to the assassination and on the day itself. So there's a memo identifying, I have to stop doing that. Let me fix that somehow. Okay, let's try, maybe that's going to work. Yeah, so there is at least one memo on identifying Phillips as being involved in exfiltration of a Cuban asset on November 22nd, and working alongside, I think it was Tony Sforza.
Is that Abardo, the guy that
who
they're
was
talking
also,
about?
sorry?
Abardo, the Cuban asset?
No, I don't think is that the Nicaraguan?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
that you're maybe mentioning. No, that's another interesting, weird story. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination was that this whole story about a guy called Alvaro who turns up and starts making these casting. He starts providing evidence that he saw Oswald in Mexico City back
And
in,
five
obviously,
thousand dollars to what he called a red-haired, what they use the term Negro, but that's exactly from the documents. I don't use that language, but that's from the document of what he said. And then I think everyone said that he was a liar or he was fabricating.
Even Phillips later Phillips even discredits him and says, and he says this again in his memoir. He says it turns out that Alvaro was working for Somoza and for the Nicaraguan intelligence, and that it may have been a plan to try and, on the part of the Nicaraguan dictator Somoza, to try and encourage an invasion, or of Castro's Cuba. But I think Alvarado did have, if I'm not mistaken, some kind of relationship with Phillips. So it sounds like it was yet another kind of psyops, kind of propaganda type operation that Phillips may have deployed, which just didn't get quite wasn't pulled off. But again, I mean, going back to that Mexico City episode, you look at those memos, and there's a lot of information being withheld, a lot of confusing information that doesn't add up. The fact that the HQ withheld that critical information that we've just gone through about Oswald in '63, didn't bother telling the Mexico City station, hang on, this guy that you've just reported hanging out in the Russian and Cuban compounds, well, yeah, he was actually, handing out pro-Castro, material in New Orleans, got into a fight with our favorite group, the DRE, blah, blah, blah. None of that's in the memo they replied to. And then they actually, despite correcting the Mexico City station on the spelling of Oswald's name, there's other inaccuracies about his actual physical description, for example. And they relay that incorrect information to the other agencies, to the FBI, Army, and Navy. So some people have speculated that this was what's known as a marked or a bent card operation, that it's a mole hunt, basically, that Oswald, as he may have been, deployed in that capacity in the Soviet Union, was again being used as part of a mole hunt. And it's particularly, of course, Angleton's team as the counterintelligence team chief, who would have been, conducting those kind of mole hunts.
Do you think the HSCA was limited because of the fact that at least two of the members went down to go investigate Mexico City? But do you think that was very, very limited in their information they can get on Mexico City because of the fact of all the intelligence operations that are running down there?
Yeah, I'm sure that obviously the House investigation, was very much hampered by information being deliberately withheld, that is still withheld 60 years on to this day. We can't get hundreds of files on these characters. So
how do you feel about that, man? It pisses me off.
Yeah, it doesn't. I'm fairly philosophical about this. I think one of the, I think, when you look at these things morally, yes, of course, as citizens, we should be angry about, this kind of power, and the wielding of that power in an amoral, unethical way, that we have, the assassination of a democratically elected and popular young charismatic president in dubious, suspicious circumstances, that has been deliberately hampered by, the investigation of which has been deliberately hampered by these agencies. That is obviously, it is a sickening crime. But I think one of the interesting things when you start to research these characters and kind of delve into their lives is that, of course, in order to write kind of or portray them accurately, you've kind of got to you've got to kind of be in their shoes a bit. You've got to see things from their perspective, understand how they viewed JFK, whether or not, we all kind of may be somewhat admiring of Kennedy's independence and his stance in many areas of policy. But for these people, the likes of Morales, Phillips, Hunt, Helms, Jenkins, etc.
Is this the S Force that Daniel P. Sheehan mentions all the time, like the same ones that Watergate burglars? It's always the same four guys or something like that.
Well, I think there's a whole nexus, isn't there, of these people. I mean, it goes back to, obviously, we were meant to be talking about Morales, and we haven't got very far with that. That's partially my fault. If you look at, Phillips's own memoirs, you look at obviously all the documentation, the memos, you can see that in Guatemala there was Phillips, Hunt, Morales, all of this, run under the likes of Tracy Barnes and, of course, Dulles, ultimately. You see the same kind of clique, again, involved in the Bay of Pigs, some, wider people as well involved by that stage, people like Richard Helms. I don't know how involved Helms was in Guatemala. But certainly in Cuban operations, the same clique, including, of course, Bill Harvey, who I don't think, again, was involved in Guatemala. And again, you see them involved in Mongoose, which is still Cuban operations. Morales is well, then a lot of these people are involved, go off to to a real war in Vietnam. Some of them are involved in Laos, like Ted Shackley and Morales, who'd been involved together in running the JM Wave station in Miami for the Cuban operations. They were involved in, I think, Laos, and then in Vietnam, and then a lot of these same characters again involved in Chile against El Linde. And some of them go on, some of the particularly Cuban assets.
Where was people... where was Morales in Dallas in '63 when Kennedy was killed?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the thing about Morales. Morales probably gives us I think, the single most, if you're looking for hard evidence, I think David Sanchez Morales is about as close a link you're going to get in terms of hard evidence to proving that the CIA was involved in the assassination of JFK, because David Morales, supposedly confessed to his best friend, Ruben Carbajal, and to an attorney as well. Both of them were in the room because Morales was kind of like, they all were a heavy drinker, basically an alcoholic, and when he got drunk, he became very indiscreet. And on one particular evening with these two friends, his tongue became quite loose, and he started. I think the attorney had mentioned something favorable about JFK, and Morales just hit the roof, and basically said, that he was a no good son of a bitch, that he'd been involved in the Bay of Pigs, he'd watched, his own men that he'd trained wiped out, and then after this like terrifying rant, basically, and Morales, you have to remember, was kind of basically a bully. He was a sociopath. He was a psychopath. He was a bully. He was a big, I think, ex-footballer, ex-obviously army guy who was very strong, very, violent, physical, and alcoholic. He was often used in the kind of riskiest black bag jobs, according to Tom Clines, who was a senior CIA officer. So he was someone who not only had training in counterintelligence and was much brighter than he let on, but he also, I think, got his hands dirty and actually did carry out, was an actual assassin. And according to Ted Shackley, he was his chief of operations at the JM Wave Miami station for Mongoose, which was, the biggest CIA station at the time, or historically, I think, until the 80s. So so that was Morales. I mean, he then said, he basically said, well, we took care of that. He went on during this rant to say, we took care of that son of a bitch, referring to JFK. And he actually also said something about that he was there in Dallas when they took care of the big one, or something to that effect. And that he'd been there in Los Angeles as well when they'd taken care of the little one, the little bastard, referring to Robert Kennedy. So I think that kind of confession is, I guess, the problem with these things is, if you want to delegitimize it, you can say, oh, well, someone said something to someone, doesn't have much traction. But the interesting thing is that more than one other person has backed up this idea that Morales is someone, a key person, CIA person, who was likely involved in the JFK assassination. First of all, Howard Hunt, in his later confessions, a lot of which have interestingly been ignored by the research community. But I think, Howard Hunt talking very interestingly, writing both in his biography, American Spy, I think it's called, and also in a video with his son, Saint John, and in an article that was an interview that was then covered by Rolling Stone at the time. Basically, Hunt paints a picture of the fact that Morales and Frank Sturgis tried to recruit him into the assassination, and that Hunt had asked, who's involved, or who, and was told by Morales that it was Bill Harvey. And Hunt said, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with anything involving that kind of psychotic, alcoholic, and supposedly left it at that and was relieved when, you know, when he realized, when it happened, of course, and realized that he'd not got involved in it at all. I mean, Hunt describes his role as a bench warmer, which is a very strange, to me, description. It's like he's some kind of substitute on team, kind of hit team or something.
That's what I said about the S Force. The S Force was the same people that Nixon used for like Watergate and all that. But that team, they think that had been in operation for long before Nixon, like during the Eisenhower stuff, had just been this team. I don't know if it's Eisenhower exactly, but around JFK's time as well is what the main thing is. And they think that this team, and it's also a theory that Daniel P. Sheehan has, which is, and I think my friend Barry Jones mentioned it to me. I think I talked about him on our first episode together. But JFK was also closing down a lot of the CIA's bases that they had and making whatever they're making. But he was shutting some of them down, and they thought that was a threat to their job. So that was one of the reasons why they think that those guys might have been responsible too.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think. I mean, this is what's also been referred to as Operation 40, is the name I know it by, and that was set up as part of Cuban operations. And Operation 40, yeah, included, I think, a lot of these people. Particularly the likes of Frank Sturgis, amongst others. There's supposedly, there's one photo that supposedly shows them all kind of cavorting at a dinner in Mexico City, and it shows, I think, people like Frank Sturgis. It interestingly shows, I think, a guy called, what's his name, Portagos, I think, who becomes a future director of the CIA. So this is a very early photo of them, but I'm not sure if that is them or not. But yeah, Operation 40. I mean, what's interesting is, of course, a lot of these people have been alleged to have been involved in these kind of black ops in certainly Cuba, also in Vietnam, Chile, probably, and some of them, I think, in things like the Che Guevara assassination, according to some sources, David Morales was involved with Felix Rodriguez, and Felix Rodriguez was a CIA asset, and was later involved. Rodriguez was later involved in Iran Contra. And Felix Rodriguez, I think he pops up. A lot of these people, again, I mean, Carl Jenkins pops up in the 80s as well, which is where all the allegations around Jenkins stem from the. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of the operative who made those allegations. Is now passed away, but yeah, so there is this clear pattern of a network or a nexus of a clique of these people who are involved in the most kind of notorious, infamous episodes of the 20th century, really. And I think that makes sense, that they kind of trusted each other, and they knew that they were very effective, that they worked well in coordination.
Well,
And
why
that
would
they,
you outsource if you have a team that works? You know what I mean? Like if you have some loyal guys that'll do anything you basically want done and they're effective because they've done it before, then it just makes sense to keep using them over and over again.
yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's just astonishing that such a relatively small clique could have affected so much kind of seismic change, really. When you think about it, and of course, they're not working in isolation, are they? They're working in tandem with all the other resources of empire that are at their disposal. Of course, you're talking about economic warfare and political action, often military involvement as well. So, but yeah, in terms of in kind of covert operations, I think this clique, probably changed the course of the Cold War, really, and was very effective on the kind of the muscle end of these operations, implementing these things. I mean, Morales, for example, was involved in the secret war in Laos. He was involved in the Phoenix assassination program in Vietnam. He was involved in the Chile operations. He was briefly in the Dominican Republic to kind of disable a radio station that they wanted taken down. Phillips was interestingly chief of station in the Dominican Republic in '65 when Johnson ordered the Marines to invade. And again, Ted Shackley was I think chief of station out in Vietnam when he recruited Morales. So Morales was someone they considered to be very able, very loyal, very effective. But yeah, he was indiscreet. More than one account indicating that from Wayne Smith, for example, who worked alongside him in the Havana um, embassy slash station, others as well, about this kind of, obviously, that JFK confession about the fact that he was quite loose-lipped. He got, a photograph late. This was later in the 70s, taken of him by some local paper with a kind of caption explaining that he was kind of in charge of the kind of counterinsurgency division or something like that. So again, the agency, particularly at that time, wouldn't have appreciated that kind of publicity. And I think Morales, towards the end, became quite paranoid about his safety, and he was living, I think, about in New Mexico, perhaps, where he'd grown up, and he had a house built and put in the kind of state of the art security, and was asked, what, you're 30 miles from the Mexican border. Why are you so worried about security? And he said to this friend, I'm not worried about the Mexicans. I'm worried about my own guys. So I think Morales, by his own account, I think he also said that he'd said to these two friends, Carbajal and the attorney, that he knew too much. And I think, of course, when you look at the suspicious spate of deaths that happened at the time of these 1970s investigations, you see the deaths of Roselli. Morales was, it seems, quite close to Roselli, taught Roselli, the gangster, a lot about kind of intelligence tradecraft. So Roselli was killed in a very
Chopped up and put in a barrel, bro.
yeah, very violent. I think, very strange story as well when the coroner's findings. But Giancana was murdered as well. You have obviously a whole bunch of other people. De Morenchild, who was Oswald Svengali, shotgun to the head, and there's on and on and on. And Morales dies. He comes back from one of his trips to Washington, where, despite retiring, he keeps getting asked to come back to help out with stuff, and he's with his best friend Carbajal, and he says, "Yeah, I haven't been feeling well since I came back from Washington." And then before he knows it, he's been admitted to hospital, put on life support, and then dies. And his wife refuses a post-mortem. Carbajal, I think, tries to go and visit him, finds that the room is already surrounded by sheriff's deputies, can't get in. And then this place in the middle of nowhere, I think in the New Mexico desert or whatever, all these, streams of dignitaries for the funeral turn up, to pay their respects to this man who, for them, had been an absolutely integral linchpin to their operations.
That suspicious death thing is so frustrating to understand because there's so many things where it's like maybe, and then there's like so many where it's like that's 100%, like a throat chop is nuts, but you get called a conspiracy. I said a throat chop is nuts when you get into the suspicious deaths, but if you even talk about something like that, people go, "Oh, that's conspiracy talk." I'm like, I'm going by what was reported. This is 100% factual in that.
I think that's one of the, because one of the stories, for example, I've spoken to, to various people, and one of the people who've come out in recent years is an ex-CIA guy called Rolf Mauer Larson. You may have come
I've
across
heard
him,
the
and
name.
he's interesting because he's probably the only living CIA person who's actually, he wasn't involved in anything back then, but he's come out and said, yeah, I can see that this was JFK assassination involved the CIA, but that it would have been, a small clique of people rather than some big national security plot. So whether this is yet another just kind of limited hangout version, the most sophisticated version of it, which is, a few rogue officers like Morales and Harvey and whoever else. Of course, that story, could fly, but one of the things that goes against it, I think, is exactly this. What you've just touched on is the number of suspicious deaths. After the Warren Commission report, and then again, you see there's a pattern to them when the 1970s investigations hot up. Again, you see the likes of Roselli, Giancana killed before they can, give away further information, and many others. You have people like Mary Pinchot Meyer, who was a Washington. I don't know if you've read Mary's Mosaic,
Shot down a trail.
Killed on a Washington, I think, canal towpath when she's out jogging or something, and she was a high Washington socialite, and she'd had an affair with JFK.
They did LSD together in bed.
Yeah, Yeah, they did LSD, and her names are on the kind of White House logs. It's verified that she was close to JFK, and supposedly was influencing him with these mind expanding drugs, and perhaps influencing his turn towards world peace, if that's what was happening. So I think when JFK was killed, Mary Meyer was devastated, and this is in Timothy Leary, the kind of godfather of drugs. Timothy Leary's the LSD guru, in his, I think, memoir, where he was close to Mary Meyer, and he says she was absolutely devastated by JFK's assassination, and that she was investigating it later, before she was, again, it's whether or not one believes that these were all actual hit jobs. The point is that they are just yet another just convenient death, isn't it? It's just they stack up. I mean, another one, of course, is Dorothy Kilgallen, who was a very well-known, prominent journalist who interviewed Jack Ruby, and reportedly said to friends that she was close to cracking the case. Who was again found dead in '65, supposedly of an.
And allegedly, Angleton was at both Mary Myers and then also Dorothy Kilgallen's and took both their journals.
I know about the whole Angleton story in Myers. I don't know. Never heard that. So about
Yeah,
Kilgallen.
apparently broke into her art studio. No, Dorothy Kilgallen broke into her home and took her journal. And I think there's a tape of him reading something from her diary where it was like, how the hell did you get that?
Okay. So I know, yeah. I mean, certainly he was caught by Ben Bradley, of all people, the Washington Post later, I guess, or I don't know if at the time, but he was later the Washington Post editor, Ben Bradley, and his wife, because Mary Meyer, I think, was the sister, was Bradley's sister-in-law. She was, I think, the sister of his wife, whose name I've forgotten, I'm afraid. But Ben Bradley was, of course, very close to JFK. But they caught Angleton in there, and that does sound like a very dodgy story, but it seems that they did actually trust him, and that there was something about the fact that um, when she died, I think something like along those lines, perhaps in her last will and testament or whatever, or in her instructions, that if anything were to happen to her, I think her sister wanted the diary to be entrusted to Angleton or something along those lines. So that story, as fishy as it does sound, actually, I think when you scrutinize it a bit further, isn't necessarily as crazy as it sounds. So I think obviously Bradley and his wife, Mary Meyer's sister, I think didn't want this information coming out either, that she'd been having an affair with JFK, because I think her diaries, which Angleton stole, contained this information about her affair and also about her own investigations. But yeah, this is the thing. Angleton keeps turning up, as part of this cleanup over years and decades. He keeps injecting himself and intervening. When Win Scott, the Mexico City station chief we mentioned, dies, Angleton swoops in again and meets his wife, who's his widowed wife, who's in shock and is mourning, and convinces her that he needs to get hold of Win Scott's files, including his unpublished manuscript for a novel about the whole Oswald story. And he gets hold of all of this stuff, and it's all sealed and transported back to Washington and never seen after that. And then when Angleton dies, CIA safecrackers had to be brought in to get into his private cache of safes. And they've supposedly found, according to his biographer, Jefferson Morley, who's an ex-Washington Post journalist himself, they found autopsy photos of Robert Kennedy, and they found a lot of material on Oswald. So quite kind of dark, disturbing stuff in keeping with Angleton's quite dark and disturbing career. So, I mean, again, Angleton, going back to David Slawson, we mentioned him, one of the Warren Commission lawyers who'd heard the Oswald tapes in '64. David Slawson, who's still alive, again, started airing his own suspicions in the '70s and got a very spooky call from Angleton, basically warning him off and saying, you've been very good and loyal so far, then, I suggest you keep, cooperating with us. So it was kind of an implicit threat, and Angleton ran his own goons. He wasn't someone to ignore threats from, basically. So yeah, Angleton, that's the part where you kind of go, well, when you're trying to demystify all of this and to decipher and unpack it, and you kind of go, well, why would, if you know, assuming Oswald is of course a patsy by all accounts, including his own, um, why would you choose someone who has all these connections to you, particularly to Angleton's team? And you kind of think, you know, surely you would choose someone else if you're, particularly if someone like Angleton's involved. But yet you kind of look at the extent to which Angleton went to kind of continue the cover up, and you kind of got to ask yourself, would you go to that kind of length and to that extent if you were just covering something up, or if you were actually involved in it? But it seems very odd, I think, to me as a obviously as a non-practitioner. I'm not a professional in terms of how they would have carried things out, but it does seem strange to me that it does seem to violate tradecraft that you would use that if this was a top level operation, if we're assuming that the Kennedy assassination, if we're saying it was a CIA operation or a national security operation, that was, you know, that people like Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, that they had given the orders, you know, and that people, very senior people like Angleton were involved, that you would use someone like Oswald who's got all these ties and connections to you. It does seem to me to violate tradecraft, but I think obviously this was 1963. Nobody imagined perhaps that any of this stuff would come out, you know, within a decade or so. But it does seem to me that you would do things in a more kind of careful way, that you would choose someone perhaps more anonymous who doesn't have these ties. So that's yeah, these kind of aspects of the story, you know, remain very mysterious, don't they?
The whole damn case is mysterious, but
Yeah.
I still appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show today, Youssef. Is there a place where people can find any of your links? And dude, your book, it's got to come out soon. You got to get on that. I'm telling you, I'm already ready to read it. I need to learn more about him. I mean, you explained a good bit, but I'm just curious to how thorough you went into him.
Into who? Sorry, into
David Atlee Phillips.
Phillips. Yeah, I mean, he's a fascinating character because he wasn't just a spy or a spook, or a covert operator. He was,
He's a
you know,
spider with legs, is what it sounds like.
yeah. I mean, he was the greatest cover up artist. He was, and he'd been, you know, in the war. He was a prisoner of war, uh, and you know, in a German POW camp. He escaped. Been shot down by the Germans, captured, escaped twice. He'd been an actor, a writer, um, you know, all of these things, and so he was a man of, you know, of many, um, you know, trades, if you like, and he deployed all of those kind of skills in his work ultimately as a spy on the world stage. He was you know, a kind of a Zelig like character if you've seen the Woody Allen film, or Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump perhaps is a more apt reference in some ways because he pops up in all these weird, unlikely places. He's in Guatemala, he's in the Bay of Pigs, he meets JFK, he knows Oswald or knows of him, he's in the Dominican Republic, he's in Chile. You know, he's accused of being Oswald's handler when all of this hots up in the 70s. So he's an absolutely, I think, fascinating character, and obviously he's been the subject of a lot of um, allegations over, you know, from over the past few decades by the research community. But it seems interestingly that a lot of people now feel that maybe that he was, along with people like Hunt and Morales and Harvey, you know, if they were involved, that wasn't the full extent of the story, and that they were kind of this kind of rogue story of a few bad apples, you know, was just um, the CIA was perhaps prepared to sacrifice them. You know, these were, in the words of David Talbot, whom you've had on the show and has written the phenomenal book, The Devil's Chessboard, on the life of Alan Dulles and the rise of the CIA. You know, in the words of David Talbot, you know, these men were indispensable until they were expendable, and that perhaps people like Phillips and Hunt during the 70s acted as a diversion from others, from perhaps something bigger or people who are more senior. And you know, I think it's likely that I think it's very likely that people, to my mind, I think Morales and Harvey definitely involved. I think the jury's still out on how much people like Phillips and Hunt knew. I suspect they must have had some kind of involvement, but I think they may have been potentially out of the loop, or they may have been, given a very limited amount of need to know information, or they may have just simply been entrapped by others, as people like Bill Simpich have argued. So it's very, very hard to tell. But I think the interesting thing is when I started writing the book, I was convinced that Phillips, based on everything I'd heard and seen online and in books and so on, I was convinced that Phillips was involved. And now I'd say it's 50-50. I think it's hard to be sure. We probably won't ever know, to be honest, whether he was specifically involved as an individual. But I think clearly there was a clique of 15 to 20, probably CIA officers who were very likely involved in the Kennedy assassination. And I think the evidence for that is increasingly more than just good circumstantial evidence. I think when you put all the pieces together, it's looking more and more kind of suspicious. And we obviously know much more than we could have ever imagined, I think, at this point, in spite of all the attempts to obfuscate and to withhold information and to destroy it. So yeah, we'll wait for the 60th anniversary and hope that in the coming years we discover more and more, Robbie, through the sterling work of the new generation, such as ourselves, and particularly yourself. Is I'm now middle aged, so we're relying on your kind of.
I'm getting there. Trust me, I'm getting there.
Yeah. Yes, it will make you age. That's true.
Youssef, where can people find your links, man? Twitter, any other links you'd like to promote?
So I've obviously hoping that the book on Phillips and his clique and the story of the CIA during the Cold War, that will hopefully come out in the near future. But in terms of my journalism, feel free to read my material on particularly the Independence website. That's a British newspaper. If you go online and search for my name in the Independent, you'll find my profile with a lot of articles, including ones that were written a few on JFK there, a couple on one on the assassination and one on his life and legacy, and one on Jackie, the movie. So plenty of material there. And if you want to see things in a bit more detail, there's my Medium blog, which delves into more left field matters.
I'll make sure to link all those in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you again. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.